The war in Gaza has entered a new chapter. After 2 years of devastating conflict, a fragile ceasefire is in place. But as the guns quiet, the real competition begins over who will shape what comes next. The front line has expanded from the battlefield to diplomatic corridors, reconstruction plans, and the struggle for political influence. The United States has moved swiftly to position itself in the lead. Meanwhile, the European Union finds itself cornered by internal divisions, structural limitations, and an uneasy dependency on Washington. To make sense of Europe's role and the risks of standing on the sidelines, we spoke with Nathalie Tocci, director of the Istituto Affari Internazionali in Rome and one of Europe's foremost observers of foreign policy. The Prime Minister of Israel recently asserted that the EU had become irrelevant to the Middle East peace process. In Tocci's view, that assertion, while pointed, carries a deeper truth. He said, "Europe has become irrelevant in the Middle East in general." Tocci reflects. She agrees, but not in the way the Israeli leader intended. Over decades, the EU has played a secondary role to the US in the region, a pattern intensified during the unpredictable and transactional diplomacy of the Trump and post-Trump eras. Tocci argues that Europe has lost its North Star, lacking both a coherent strategic compass and the political will to lead independently. But the irony, she suggests, lies deeper. When Israel's Prime Minister claims irrelevance, what he implies is that Europe has grown too critical of Israel, wielding pressure instead of partnership. Tocci counters this interpretation. The real problem is that Europe has repeatedly failed to press, even when it had leverage. She points out that the Israeli government itself has made clear its lack of interest in a peace process leading to a two-state solution, an approach Europe has been reluctant to challenge directly. Given that the EU is Israel's largest trade partner, why has it never seriously used that relationship as leverage? Tocci calls this the trillion-dollar question. In fairness, she concedes, Brussels has flirted with consequences. The European Commission once proposed suspending Israel's trade preferences under the EU-Israel Association Agreement. But that proposal remains on hold. Why? Because some major member states, notably Italy and Germany, have balked. Their resistance has stalled any collective European movement. Even when political will among member countries exists, Tocci warns, it's often deferred in the name of diplomatic expediency. With the introduction of a peace plan, many governments side with relieved, that is, that they might avoid confrontation with Israel at all. But Tocci believes this is precisely the moment when pressure should intensify, not recede. If Europe hopes to reclaim a meaningful role in the region, it must be willing to impose costs, to make real the political weight behind its rhetoric. One of the recurring explanations for the EU's inaction is internal division, the perennial "Europe is too fractured" trope. Tocci acknowledges that consensus has frayed, but rejects division as a permanent excuse. She recalls the era from the 1982 Venice Declaration through the early 2000s, when the EU gradually built a shared vision of what a two-state solution should look like. Over the past decade, and especially in the past 2 years, that consensus has unraveled. Still, Tocci cautions, division only becomes a convenient alibi when no one seeks to transcend it. She points to the war in Ukraine as an example. Though the EU was far from unified at first, internal pressure and conditionality were used to coerce reluctant states, and a functional unity eventually emerged. The Middle East, she says, has simply been allowed to remain an area of European passivity, hidden behind a cover of fragmentation. One of the sharper contrasts Tocci draws is between Europe's assertiveness on Ukraine and its timidity in Gaza. In the Ukraine context, she argues, Europe recognized early that its security and strategic interests were directly at stake. Even in the face of flip-flops in Washington, Brussels stayed the course. In Gaza, Tocci says that clear self-interest is not perceived. Values, she suggests, don't fully explain the disparity either. The humanitarian case for action in Gaza is arguably as strong as in Ukraine. In the end, she believes it comes down to willingness to pay a price, whether that means running counter to US policy, confronting Israel, or risking deeper political backlash at home. And until Europe is willing to absorb those costs, both diplomatic and political, she says, it will remain a bystander, not a player. Even as she delivers a blunt critique of Europe's standing, Tocci does not abandon the possibility of a comeback. The question is, how? First, she warns, we must acknowledge that peace is never cheap. Europe's expansive sanctions regime on Russia didn't come without domestic backlash or complex compromises. Seeking peace in the Middle East requires similar hard choices. In Gaza, Europe cannot expect to wield influence without first accepting friction with the United States or Israel. Second, Europe must move beyond being a payer to becoming an actor. In the newly emerging architecture for Gaza's future, the governance, policing, border control and reconstruction schemes, the EU should press to be part of the core mechanisms, not a guest, but a stakeholder. She points to EU missions like EU-BAM Rafah and EU-Pol COPS as tools that should be reinvigorated and deployed in the coming phase. Third, Europe must link its financial support to conditionality, not only for Israel's compliance with ceasefire obligations and international law, but also reforms in the Palestinian Authority. If the EU truly aims for influence commensurate with its funding, it must adopt timelines and firm benchmarks. As a timely commentary put it, if the EU wants influence commensurate with its funding, it needs to lock in timelines. Fourth, Europe must prioritise recovery anchored in human need, not prestige projects. The rebuild in Gaza should focus first on water, power, schools, especially for injured children, hospitals, not monuments. The echoing principle, reconstruction must start from essential services outwards. Finally, Europe must step up its diplomatic agility. Washington may still dominate the initial architecture, but deft European diplomacy can retain critical relevance, especially in multilateral, UN-based legitimacy and in bridging Arab, Egyptian, Jordanian, Palestinian and Israeli interests. Tocci's fundamental point, Europe must be ready to pay the price in credibility, in tension, in political cost. Without that readiness, it will remain forever on the sidelines. Beyond high diplomacy, the situation in Gaza remains stark. The United Nations has warned that certain zones of Gaza now face famine conditions, prompting demands on Israel to open all border crossings to facilitate aid flows. Trucks are trickling in, but barely enough. The World Food Programme reports it has delivered around 560 tons of food daily under the ceasefire. Northern Gaza, however, remains largely cut off due to destroyed infrastructure, blocked roads, and closed crossings like Zikim and Erez. In one interview, a WFP spokeswoman said, "We have 500,000 people in the north of Gaza who have been in famine conditions. Food distributions are starting to happen. We sent 57 trucks. We need a ceasefire, a complete lull in fighting." Her words reflect the fragility of the moment, an opening, yes, but one that could easily close if conflict resumes. Border crossings remain contested. The Rafah crossing, Gaza's southern gateway to Egypt, remains partially closed. Israel has postponed reopening it, citing non-compliance by Hamas in returning hostages remains. Meanwhile, the process of hostage returns is ongoing. Hamas has handed over a limited number of bodies, though many remain under rubble. Israel continues to pressure Hamas to expedite the process, with the release of aid possibly tied to further returns. The consequences of renewed fighting would be dire. A WFP representative warned a ceasefire is the only way that we can scale up and reach all the people in need in Gaza. We need this ceasefire to hold. Unless we have a complete lull in fighting, it will not work. In short, there is no real humanitarian plan unless the guns stay silent. The path ahead is becoming clearer. The ceasefire may be just a prelude. Israel and Hamas now face a roadmap that includes prisoner exchanges, reconstruction, and potentially a transitional governance model in Gaza. The US has positioned itself as the principal mediator and, in some quarters, the principal power broker. European capitals, meanwhile, risk becoming backseat observers unless they move swiftly. Calls for deeper European involvement have intensified. A commentary from the European Union Institute for Security Studies urges that the bloc now needs to link enforcement of its sanctions proposals to compliance with the ceasefire and push for political substance beyond rhetoric. At the Sharm el-Sheikh summit in mid-October, EU leaders reaffirmed their commitment to Gaza's stabilisation and reconstruction, citing their readiness to engage through border, security and policing missions. But the question remains, will that commitment be backed by urgency and leverage? The Israeli government, for now, seems cautious. While it accepted the ceasefire, it retains the upper hand. Restrictions on crossings remain, and its willingness to allow a truly independent European role is uncertain. The Palestinian Authority has said it is ready to resume operations at Rafah, but its inclusion in governance remains contested. In the final analysis, Tocci argues Europe must choose. Will it invest political credibility in Gaza, even if that means friction with the US or Israel? Or will it cede the field to American and regional power brokers, relegating itself to donor status? Her view is uncompromising. Unless Europe is ready to impose costs, impose conditions, and act as more than a checkbook, it will be locked out of the next chapter of the Middle East.